You're listening to Zodiac Speaking, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, DNA ID, Beyond Bizarre True Crime, and Scene of the Crime. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
This is the Zodiac Speaking. Beginning in 1945, a series of gruesome murders in North Kenmore and Edgewater, Chicago, would shock the neighborhood. The first victim, Josephine Ross, aged 43, was stabbed multiple times in her apartment at 4108 North Kenmore Avenue on June 5, 1945. There were no signs of robbery or sexual assault. 7 months later, on December 10, 1945, the body of Frances Brown, aged 33, was discovered in her 3941 North Pine Grove apartment with a knife protruding from her neck and a bullet wound to her head. Again, the crime appeared motiveless. However, this crime differed from the Josephine Ross murder because the killer had left a calling card in the form of a message written on the apartment wall in red lipstick. It read, "For heaven's sake, catch me before I kill more. I cannot control myself." Only 28 days would pass before the next murder, when 6-year-old Suzanne Degnan was reported missing from her first-floor bedroom in Edgewater on January 7, 1946. With a ladder propped up beside her window and a ransom note found, time was of the essence in the search for the young girl. The ransom note read, "Get $20,000 ready and wait for my word. Do not notify the FBI or police. Bills are in 5s and 10s. Burn this for her safety." The ransom note was followed by a series of menacing phone calls to the Degnan home, demanding the money be paid. Unfortunately, the search for Suzanne Degnan wouldn't end well when investigators discovered the severed head of the young girl in a sewer, only 1 block from the family home, and her remaining body parts were found scattered in other sewers, drains, and catch basins during the remainder of the search. On June 26, 1946, 17-year-old William Hearns was arrested for attempted burglary, beginning a chain of events that would ultimately see him charged with the 3 murders, after an alleged confession and a claimed fingerprint match from a door jamb in the apartment of Frances Brown. Despite being given 3 life sentences, William Hearns, widely referred to as the Lipstick Killer, protested his innocence until his death in the University of Illinois Medical Center on February 26, 2012. Many people believe he was wrongly convicted of the crimes. These crimes may seem far removed from the Zodiac Killer's exploits in Northern California, until we look closer into his communications that often referenced material that long predated his crimes, such as the comic opera The Mikado, released in 1885, and the short story The Most Dangerous Game, first published by Richard Connell on January 19, 1924. If nothing else, the Zodiac appeared to be literary-minded and an avid reader of newspapers. The Zodiac pleaded with Melvin Belli on December 20, 1969, when he wrote a letter to the prominent attorney's home address stating, "Please help me," and claimed he was afraid, quote, "I cannot remain in control for much longer," and he was worrying that he might take his 9th and 10th victim. This language somewhat mirrored the lipstick writing on the apartment wall of Frances Brown, which pleaded with police to catch me because he feared, quote, "I cannot control myself and may kill more."
A comparison of 2 pieces of distant writing may not seem that compelling until we take a look at the next appearance of the Zodiac pseudonym after the Melvin Belli letter, which appeared on the apartment wall of 40-year-old Robert Michael Salem when he was murdered in his apartment at 745 Stevenson Street, San Francisco, on April 15th, 1970. The crime scene had one striking similarity to the murder of Frances Brown in 1945, in that red writing was evident on the apartment wall, stating Satan Saves and Zodiac, and was accompanied by the drawing of an Egyptian ankh, which was commonly held in the hands of ancient Egyptian deities to represent their power to sustain life and to revive human souls in the afterlife. However, the writing on the apartment wall of Robert Salem was written in blood, not lipstick. If the Melvin Belli letter incorporated wording inspired from the wall of Francis Brown, then it's striking that a second wall in Robert Salem's apartment would also seem inspired from the murder of Francis Brown, accompanied by the pseudonym Zodiac. In other words, the Melvin Belli letter incorporated Zodiac and Francis Brown together, as did the wall of Robert Salem. Both Francis Brown and Robert Salem lived in an apartment, and both suffered knife wounds to their body. If the murderer of Robert Salem wasn't the Zodiac killer, did the impersonator of Zodiac forge this connection after only 4 months, or is the argued connection coincidental? Dubbed the Bloody Satan murder by the San Francisco Chronicle newspaper, Robert Salem, a lamp designer, was discovered in his hippie-style apartment on April the 19th, 1970 by some of his friends who worked at the nearby Franciscan Hotel after realising they hadn't seen him for several days and subsequently noticed a pungent smell oozing from the apartment. Robert Salem had been stabbed once in the chest and 6 times in the back, nearly decapitated, and his left ear had been severed and removed from the crime scene by the perpetrator. The murderer of Susan Degnan in Edgewater, Chicago on January the 7th, 1946 had successfully decapitated the young girl, unlike the killer of Robert Salem, but body parts were removed in both cases. Robert Salem was pretty successful by all accounts, having a number of his artistic lamps displayed in major museums. His designs had been exhibited in England, Japan and Russia under State Department cultural exchange programs. The previous year, in 1969, he had been the lighting designer and consultant for the restoration of the historic Hazlitt Warehouse at 680 Beach Street at Hyde, Russian Hill, San Francisco. The Hazlitt Warehouse is located just 1.5 miles from where it is believed the Zodiac killer entered the taxicab of Paul Stein on October the 11th, 1969. The location of the Hazlitt Warehouse, listed as Beach Street, would come into play just 4 days before the Paul Stein murder, when a potential Zodiac correspondence was addressed to Vallejo Police Sergeant John Lynch on October the 7th, 1969. This communication referenced Beach Street.
The letter, postmarked San Mateo and addressed to Sergeant John Lynch on October 7, 1969, was extremely cryptic in nature. Sergeant John Lynch described the letter as follows. The writer has a strong feeling of ESP. While having these feelings, the writer writes with a pencil. On occasion, while thinking of the code letters, the pencil wrote, "Go to 56 Beach Street. I get the name Jerry. Perhaps he knows people where his name is XXXXXXX, or in other words, a redacted name." It's extremely difficult to deduce a great deal from this correspondence, but it was signed "A Good Citizen," in similar fashion to the August 10, 1969 Concerned Citizen card, also mailed to Sergeant John Lynch. Both were signed with the citizen tag. Both were mailed to the same recipient just 2 months apart, and both probably referenced the solved 408 cipher. The August 10, 1969 correspondence applied a valid key to the 408 cipher, which was split into 3 parts and mailed to the San Francisco Chronicle, the Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald by the Zodiac. The October 7, 1969 correspondence referenced code letters in the plural, so it was also likely to have been referring to the 3 code letters mailed to the 3 Bay Area newspapers that ultimately formed the 408 cipher. The August 10, 1969 communication wasn't released into the public domain, so the author of the Good Citizen letter could not have mimicked the Concerned Citizen letter. This indicates the author of both communications was almost certainly the same person, irrespective of whether it was the Zodiac killer or not. The October 7, 1969 correspondence stated, Go to 56 Beach Street. But a quick search of Google Maps provides nothing relevant. However, 56 Beach Street in San Francisco is the old block numbering from the original planning maps, which comes out as 1654 to 1656 on the actual street numbering. Therefore, we have a communication mailed just 4 days before the Paul Stine murder at Washington and Cherry Streets, from where the killer claimed later he escaped into the Presidio Park, a park that has Beach Street situated at the northeast corner, not far from its edge. Many Zodiac sleuths believe that the killer escaped into the park and headed to its eastern edge. If the Good Citizen letter was authored by the Zodiac, one could argue that Beach Street was at least familiar to the Killer of Five. Beach Street was also the location of the historic Hazlitt warehouse, where lamp designer Robert Salem worked in 1969, and he had a Zodiac pseudonym written in blood on his wall. Another interesting feature of Beach Street can be found in Wikipedia. It states, during the 1960s, California was the site of many outdoor art fairs, which nurtured a culture of independent artists and craftspersons. At this time, there was an effort to sell crafts on the sidewalks of the liberal Haight-Ashbury neighborhood of San Francisco. Artists and street performers who illegally set up in public areas were frequently harassed and arrested by the police. In the 700 block of Beach Street, adjacent to the Victorian Park and near Fisherman's Wharf, between 15 and 25 artists would set up their displays and use lookouts to alert them to the arrival of police.
The Wikipedia section regarding Beach Street mentioned that it had many outdoor art fairs with independent artists and craftspersons, and we know that Robert Salem, who worked at the Hazlitt warehouse, was an artist and craftsman. The Hazlitt warehouse at 680 Beach Street was right next to the 700 block, where 15 to 20 artists would set up their displays and use lookouts to alert them to the arrival of the police. If the Zodiac Killer, or random killer, crossed paths with Robert Salem during one of these arts fairs, or knew him through the Hazlitt warehouse, could the killer have duped a trusting Salem into believing he wanted to purchase some of his designs, or simply befriended him under the pretense of a common interest in the arts? Inspectors Gus Carreras and John Fatinos said they did not believe the Zodiac Killer was connected to the case, stating, quote, "Probably the person we are after wanted us to think it was Zodiac, but other than the word on the wall, there is absolutely nothing linking Zodiac to the murder of Mr. Salem," end quote. Law enforcement clearly didn't believe a connection existed to the Zodiac Killer, but if it was Zodiac who wrote on the wall, they would still have drawn the same conclusion, just like investigators did with every phone call subsequent to September the 27th, 1969. Would they have drawn the same conclusion at Lake Berryessa in absence of the payphone call to David Slate? However, it is still reasonable to argue for a killer who simply wanted to palm the murder off onto the Zodiac Killer by writing his pseudonym on the wall of the apartment and misdirect the police. But if the person was reasonably aware of the Zodiac Killer's story, why wouldn't they opt for the obvious and draw the crosshairs of Zodiac on the wall rather than an Egyptian ankh, never before used by the Bay Area murderer? The body of Robert Michael Salem was discovered on April the 19th, 1970, with the San Francisco Chronicle featuring the story on April the 20th and April the 21st on page 1 and page 3 respectively. The envelope of the Zodiac Killer's 13-symbol cipher and bus bomb diagram was postmarked in the morning on the same day as the Robert Salem article hit the newsstands, which is either sheer coincidence or he managed to read the first Robert Salem article and create this latest communication in double quick time to have it mailed with an AM, April the 20th, 1970 postmark. Or he had prepared the letter in advance because he was the murderer of Robert Salem. Bearing in mind the Zodiac Killer wrote, "P.S. I hope you have fun trying to figure out who I killed. You have 3 options to choose from."
With a fair degree of confidence, the August 10th and October 7th, 1969 communications can be linked to one author, with the second communication extremely cryptic and mysterious in design. It's thought by some that the August 10, 1969 correspondence was from a helpful citizen providing a key to unlocking the 408 cipher. But if this was the case, why would this helpful citizen mail a second communication with such an unhelpful and cryptic message that literally needs decoding to understand it? One correspondence providing a solution, and one just confusing the reader. This may negate the notion of a helpful citizen, and point more towards somebody like the Zodiac playing games with Sergeant John Lynch of the Vallejo Police Department, and the police in general. If it was the Zodiac who wrote both communications, was he attempting to correct his original 408 cipher by offering a revised key that equally contained some errors? The concerned citizen card read, "Dear Sergeant Lynch, I hope the enclosed key will prove to be beneficial to you in connection with the cipher letter writer. Working puzzles, cryptograms, and word puzzles is one of my pleasures. Please forgive the absence of my signature or name, as I do not wish to have my name in the papers, and it could be mentioned by a slip of the tongue. With best wishes, concerned citizen." This communication contained the word name twice, as did the good citizen correspondence 2 months later, despite both being textually brief. Both were referring to the 408 cipher, and both were mailed to Sergeant John Lynch, and finally, both withheld the identity of the sender. Knowing who Jerry is, mentioned in the good citizen communication, may help crack this puzzle, assuming the person really exists. A cursory search on Google has unearthed a Jerry living on Beach Street, but whether he was a resident at that location in 1969 has not been ascertained. If someone listening to this podcast has access to any ancestry records for a Jerry living anywhere in Beach Street, San Francisco, in 1969 or thereabouts, please don't hesitate to leave a message at zodiackiller.net.
Statistics show that the vast majority of people murdered are killed by somebody they know, who inevitably knows something about their life. Robert Michael Salem may have interacted with somebody at his workplace, at the Hazlitt warehouse or the arts fair nearby, who befriended him and gained his trust. He was murdered with a long-bladed knife in an apartment that showed no forced entry. The murderer even took the time to take a shower after the murder to wash away the blood transfer during the callous murder, yet attempted to decapitate Robert Salem before failing and cutting off his left ear. Did he intend to use this trophy as proof he was the murderer, in similar fashion to the shirt piece received by the San Francisco Chronicle in the aftermath of the Paul Stine murder? Or was he just a morbid collector of trophies who lazily attempted to misdirect law enforcement towards the Zodiac Killer? It is tempting to believe that the newspaper story of Robert Salem on April the 20th, 1970, coinciding with the Zodiac letter on the same date, after a hiatus of 4 months, must be somehow connected, especially when you consider the wording Zodiac chose when he stated, "I have killed 10 people to date, and I hope you have fun trying to figure out who I killed." The use of "to date" could imply right up to the time this letter was mailed on April the 20th, 1970, thereby indicating a most recent murder, such as Robert Salem. The Zodiac Killer may not be responsible for the killing, but the implication of his involvement might have been enough to keep him newsworthy and relevant to law enforcement as an ongoing and credible threat. If the letter was created in haste, did it hold clues, possibly in the 13 ciphertext characters, to the recent attack at 745 Stevenson Street in San Francisco? The Zodiac Killer went out of his way to provide the newspapers with evidence he was responsible for 3 of the attacks, writing on the car door and making a phone call after the attack at Lake Berryessa. Unfortunately, post-Presidio Heights, this was sadly lacking, leading many to believe the murder of Paul Stine was the final attack of the Zodiac Killer. Although the Robert Salem murder scene did contain the Zodiac pseudonym written on the apartment wall, as did the Lake Berryessa crime scene contain the Zodiac crosshairs, with both attacks committed with a long-bladed knife, this is not proof of Zodiac involvement. Nevertheless, The murder of Robert Salem just a few days prior to the April the 20th, 1970 communication is a noteworthy addition, worthy of a closer look.
This is the Zodiac speaking.
Right, Mike, there was a pause of 4 months in Zodiac communications from the Melvin Belli letter to the April the 20th, 1970 letter. Do we really believe it coincidence that the Zodiac wrote, "I hope you have fun trying to figure out who I killed," on the same day the pseudonym Zodiac appeared on the apartment wall of murdered Robert Salem, as reported in the newspapers? If he was responding to the newspapers and didn't kill Robert Salem, then when the article appeared in the Chronicle in the morning, the Zodiac had to create the letter with code and bus bomb diagram almost immediately, post the letter and have it collected and postmarked inside of a few hours because it had an AM postmark on it. How on earth would that be possible if he hadn't prepared the letter in advance?
Yeah, that's something that's pretty puzzling, to unless it's just a coincidence that maybe he sent that letter out and then there happens to be the high-profile murder there on Robert Salem. I'm curious what your take is. I know you've got you've spent a lot of time examining it. I'm curious what your take is on it.
Well, I find it extremely unlikely that after a hiatus of 4 months, he would just happen to randomly write a letter asking people to figure out who he killed the same day his pseudonym appeared on that wall. Zodiac, in other words. Plus, he drew an Egyptian ankh, which represents the future existence in Egyptian mythology or, superstition. So I hear coincidence bandied around a lot, but I find this difficult to find that he wasn't responding to this crime scene and thought, I'll capitalise on this. My name is appeared on a wall. Whether he actually committed the murder, because it was committed on the 15th of April. So he could have prepared the bulk of the letter earlier and added a little bit to it. But I find it highly unlikely this letter was totally unrelated to the Robert Salem murder, which we'll get into in a little bit more detail later in the podcast. But I don't know if you carry the same thoughts.
Well, the timing is crucial. If he mailed the letter before the mention was in the newspaper, that's one thing. If he somehow mailed the letter after the detail about Zodiac on the wall ran in the paper, then that could definitely be him just simply responding to the media and getting a chance to have his name out there once again. So
Can I just add something?
Yeah, absolutely.
2 articles came out about Robert Salem. He wasn't discovered till April the 19th in the evening. And so the newspaper reported the crime on the 20th in the morning, in the Chronicle edition in the morning. So there's no way he could, if he either had to be the murderer or had some inside information, i.e. he worked at the newspapers or he worked with the police. And if this was related, he would create the code, all the diagram, the whole letter, and got it out there quick enough to be collected, taken back to the mailing station and postmarked within a matter of hours. Because I'm assuming the Chronicle edition would have come out in the early hours of the morning, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I would think so. A lot of people used to get the newspaper on their way to work, or some of them would have it delivered and they'd have it with their morning coffee and eat breakfast and read through the paper. So the timing definitely seems really compelling, the fact that he writes this first letter in a while, and it's basically right when the Robert Salem stuff is breaking. But, to your point, if, again, it comes down to that timing, if he mailed it, physically put it in the mail, wrote the letter and put it in the mailbox before he read the paper, that's pretty interesting. But if it's a question of him putting it in there and, writing the letter after he just read it in the paper, then it could be just a case where he's trying to hype up, his kill count and get a little bit of attention.
He also wrote, I have killed 10 people to date. Why didn't he just put 10 next to his crosshair? The emphasis on I've killed 10 people to date seems to place a bit of an emphasis on today's date, which would have been the 20th. Do you get that feeling?
Yeah, it could be, and it also could mean that he's intending on killing more people. It might be just the phrase that he used, if he was someone that used that phrase when he wrote letters and stuff like that. So I don't know if it has a real important meaning, but, it is open to interpretation, I guess.
See, this code was by far the shortest offering the Zodiac Killer gave of the 4 widely accepted ciphers. Therefore, we could argue that because it was the shortest, the time constraints of getting this code out in time to have it published that day or that same morning the newspaper article came out, which is why the code was relatively short. But he also had to mail it, enable it to be postmarked in the morning. So it could be that this code wasn't pre-prepared and was contemporary in nature, possibly about Robert Salem.
And it definitely, I can see.
What are your thoughts on the code?
Well, I can see that the code, that code's important to Zodiac, and it's just one more attempt to make the police jump through hoops trying to figure out what he's doing. And, I think what better way than to give him a code to give them some busy work.
Here's something interesting I found about a week ago. The drawing on the wall of Robert Salem was described as an Egyptian ankh in the newspapers. But it wasn't described like that on the 20th. It was described that on the 21st. So there's no way he could have picked that up until the 21st, which means when he created the letter, it was created from what he read in the newspaper on the 20th alone. In the 20th newspaper, it was described as a strange symbol resembling a crucified man. I believe the Zodiac drew a crude anchor on his 13-character code, not an upside-down Aries like a lot of people believe, because the anchor is a symbol which represents hope in a future existence for Christians, which ties in with the 888 of Christian numerology that represents Jesus, and the Celtic cross, which he drew in the code as well, which is a form of Christian cross. His crude anchor drawing in the code has the same phonetic root as ankh, i.e. ankh or anchor, which wasn't released to the newspapers on the 20th. Now, additionally, I looked at it, and if we superimpose that crude anchor from his code over the drawing on the wall, it creates a full and proper image of a Christian anchor. It appears that the imagery on the wall of Robert Salem's apartment, along with Satan Saves and the 3 Christian elements in his code, inextricably links the Salem murder to his letter, indicating that I hope you have fun trying to figure out who I killed was almost certainly a reference to Salem. Do you find a religious connection viable, bearing in mind he would later use a crucifix and constantly refer to paradise, which adds more emphasis to this crime possibly being from him? I'm not promoting it as a Zodiac crime, but it's worth investigating a little bit more because it's contemporary rather than the Sherry Joe Bates murder, which was pre-Zodiac.
Yeah, I tend to think that Zodiac didn't kill Robert Salem. It doesn't fit his known MO of driving up on lone victims and surprising them or killing someone in a car. This is definitely not an established type of pattern from Zodiac. Could he have killed people in different ways? Sure, but I think we've seen some little hints of religion from Zodiac, and who knows, he may have been religious or had some kind of religious upbringing, and he hinted at it in his letters. So it's an interesting angle to look at any kind of language that has a little bit of religion in it. It may be a clue as to who he is and what inspires him.
Yeah, irrespective of whether this was Zodiac or not, I was analysing the religious component to it. Because what we do know of Robert Salem, he was a gay man. Now, just to add a little bit more, the Egyptian ankh is also known as the Crux Ansata, and that was found not only on the wall of Robert Salem's apartment, but it was found on his stomach. I don't know if it was etched in with a knife or whether it was just drawn in blood. I'm not particularly a religious person, but I went looking for a bit of religious stuff, and I found out that a disciple of Jesus attempted to protect him from arrest by severing the ear of Malchus, who was a servant of the Jewish high priest Caiaphas. Now remember that Robert Salem had his ear removed. So we have an image of a crucified man on the stomach of Robert Salem, and his left ear was severed. Then I found that in 1 Corinthians 5:5, it had a verse that read like so: to deliver such an one unto Satan for the destruction of the flesh, that the spirit may be saved in the day of Lord Jesus. The idea was that to cure sexual immorality, the subject was to be delivered unto Satan to be saved. Hence why I looked at the meaning on the wall, Satan Saves, written in blood on the apartment wall, accompanied by a crucified man. And then what I did was I took the word Satan, and remember I spoke to you about the 148 character cipher and letter in 1971?
Yep.
And in that, he talked about skinning kids. He used the word skin twice. And because Robert Salem had something drawn on his stomach and his ear was removed, I took the template of skin and Satan together, and I tried to stick it in the cipher, and I got Skin a Satanist. And that fits the cipher perfectly. So it's a solution that is at least totally contemporary to the murder of Robert Salem, and not just some random thing that I've plucked out of my head. It's to do with what's on the wall and to do what happened to him. So I thought that was interesting. Now, flipping it a little bit, if we go to Berryessa and we didn't have the phone call, because police were very skeptical about this being Zodiac. They said all there is the writing on the wall saying Zodiac, and that's all we've really got. Take away the phone call at Berryessa, do you think the police would have adopted the same approach there and said, well, all we've got is the writing on the car door, we don't believe this is Zodiac?
I think, can you just repeat that again, Rich?
If you take away the phone call after the Berryessa attack, and all we had was the writing on the car door, similar to the writing on this apartment wall. On the apartment wall, it had the pseudonym Zodiac. On the car, all it had was his crosshairs and the list of the dates. So without that phone call, do you think the police would have been as skeptical towards Lake Berryessa as they were to the Robert Salem murder?
Yeah, I think obviously that the writing seemed to match. He's taking claim of the dates. The phone call matches Zodiac's pattern, whereas if we compare that to Robert Salem, there was no phone calls as far as we know, at least. And the murder was different. We don't know that Zodiac ever went into someone's home and attacked them or murdered them. So I tend to lean towards, and again, the police, maybe they're the same thinking, that it was like a copycat, a Zodiac copycat, wanted to copy the notoriety, but because of the interesting religious findings that you found and the ear and that kind of stuff, I think it's possible that whoever killed Robert Salem maybe thought of him as a sinner and, was some kind of inspired by religion to save this person that he viewed as a sinner. And he murdered him, and this stuff is some kind of extravagant religious stuff. And I personally think that he just used the Zodiac name because it was getting attention in that area. But the killing itself and the other religious things don't really mirror Zodiac, and as does, nor does the MO of mutilating someone or entering their apartment and killing them.
Do you think the 4 crimes showed escalation?
Yeah, I mean, do you think
the Stein was more of an escalation to Lake Berryessa, or do you think Lake Berryessa was his main crime in terms of the gravity of it?
I don't know. The Stein murder was sort of back to his old ways of shooting someone, and cars involved, they're versus out in the open during the daytime and stabbing them. That was a little bit of a different departure for Zodiac. We can go back to the debate, was Sherry Jo Bates killed by Zodiac? And then, we have a knife then, if that's the case. We could go back to the Domingos Edwards case where there was evidence that a knife was used to cut clothing. So, there's a knife in that case, but again, those are non-confirmed Zodiac cases. But the ones we know for sure, the MO we know for sure about Zodiac is he found random people, and usually at night, in cars, around cars, and attacked them. And then Lake Berryessa was sort of a different animal for him at that point. So I wonder if he just went back to basics and went back to what he knew with Paul Stine.
In the Paul Stine crime scene, he obviously took the shirt piece, and in the Robert Salem murder, he took the ear. So I was considering whether this was escalation on his part. In both the Robert Salem sort of had two key things from the previous two crimes. There was writing at the crime scene, plus there was removing something from the crime scene, as in Presidio Heights.
Well, I know, and Zodiac was all about proving that he did something. Mailing stuff in, making phone calls. A little bit different than just writing something on a wall. Anyone can write Zodiac on a wall and try and take credit. Zodiac himself, the real Zodiac, we know he called, he mailed letters, he sent stuff in, he sent bloody shirt pieces. If Robert Salem's ear got sent into the mail to police, that would be right up Zodiac's alley, but that didn't happen. So I wonder if it was just some kind of weird trophy that person took, and where Zodiac would take stuff so he could send it in later as proof. And this person, never mailed it in. So that's a little bit different from Zodiac.
And also at the Robert Salem crime scene, the person wrote Zodiac, but if he was really trying to convince us he was Zodiac, wouldn't he have used a crosshair rather than an Egyptian ankh if he was trying to sell us a story?
Yeah, and again, the mention of Satan, Zodiac, it never mentioned Satan. But if they just wrote Zodiac and a crosshair logo, that would definitely scream more Zodiac. But the other stuff is stuff that really we didn't see from Zodiac. So again, unless the case is solved somehow one day, it probably won't. We won't have any definitive answers. My personal opinion is that it was just some kind of disturbed person with some kind of religious inspiration, and they just, because Zodiac was getting attention, they splashed Zodiac up on the wall. And to me, that's what I think happened.
And also they said that the Zodiac tended to attack the women more, which led me to believe, and other people as well, to believe that's why he targeted Paul Stine. But also after the Paul Stine murder, they labelled him as a latent homosexual, which got me thinking whether he then decided, hey, I'm going to target homosexuals now, the same way as he targeted Paul Stine because of the sexual connotations they were throwing at him.
Yeah, and it could be. And if there was any truth to the theory that Zodiac was homosexual, perhaps he would know Robert Salem and move in those circles and have some kind of connection to him, and maybe that's how he came into contact with him. Again, we'd have to prove that Robert Salem was definitely a Zodiac victim, but that could open up some different lines of examination going down that road.
Here's something regarding some other potential Zodiac letters. Now, apart from the Washington and Maple reference by Zodiac in his letter after the Stine murder, the only other time a Zodiac or potential letter from Zodiac mentioned the name of a street was the Good Citizen letter mailed to Sergeant John Lynch on October the 7th, 1969. This letter mentioned 56 Beach Street, a street where Robert Salem had worked throughout 1969, where he had been given a lighting designer job in the restoration of the Hazlitt warehouse at 680 Beach Street. Now, Beach Street is virtually joined to the northeast corner of Presidio Park, where Zodiac may have escaped on October the 11th, 1969. The October the 7th letter, this is, don't forget, 4 days before the Stine murder, mentioned Jerry with a J, but this could be a nickname for George or Gerald. So an attempted search for somebody living on Beach Street in 1969 may bear some fruit. The name Jerry may be a red herring or a mistake by the author, but can you see any significance regarding Beach Street or the name Jerry?
Well, and was the, refresh my memory, was the Good Citizen letter, was it Beach Street in San Francisco?
There isn't a Beach Street, 56 Beach Street in San Francisco, because Sergeant John Lynch had a problem finding it. But somebody helped me on my website and went on the original planning maps. I can't remember what they're called in America, but it was 1654 Beach Street or 1656 Beach Street, to the best of my knowledge. So that was the address he was referencing when he mentioned 56 Beach Street was 1656 or 1654. 56 was the original address in the planning maps. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing. Just the fact there's a Beach Street connection is just one more connection. You
were looking at Gerald Taggart, you see.
Yeah.
And I know Jerry can be used as a slang for Gerald. It was a bit of a stretch because I don't think Gerald Taggart has any connection to Beach Street or San Francisco, does he?
No. Not that I know of, anyhow.
So the letter is very cryptic in nature, but it's almost certainly by the same person who wrote the Concerned Citizen letter. Now, little attention is paid to the Good Citizen letter compared to the Concerned Citizen letter, which, if you remember, was postmarked August the 10th. The August the 10th communication containing the 408 code key, if you remember, has been analysed to death, but the October the 7th letter is widely ignored. Now, both communications are addressed to Sergeant John Lynch. Both are referring to the 408 cipher because the Good Citizen letter mentions code letters, and that means the 3 letters sent to the 3 newspapers. Both use the word name twice, despite both communications being brief, and both use the word citizen to sign off. So bearing in mind the Concerned Citizen card was not in the public domain by October the 7th, it's almost certain that if Zodiac created the code key on August the 10th, he created the October the 7th, 1969 letter 4 days before the Stein murder. So why are people so apathetic to communications beyond what they have been told to be genuine? And what are your thoughts on the person behind the August the 10th Concerned Citizen letter and code key? Do you think that was Zodiac?
Yeah, it's a tough...
Because if you believe that, then you almost have to believe this letter's genuine because they were consecutive.
Yeah, that pattern. And there is a Beach Street, I just checked, by the way, in Vallejo. So that it could be a coincidence if the Beach Street in Vallejo and the Beach Street where Robert Salem worked were 2 different Beach Streets. But, it is interesting, the timing, that those authors probably are the same.
The message said, "Go to 56 Beach Street. I get the name Jerry. Perhaps he knows people, or his name is," and then it had 7 X's. Yeah. I was really hoping it would be 6 X's for Taggart, but...
Yeah. Well, it doesn't mean it's not someone else named Jerry or Gerald. That is someone else with just a different Gerald.
Did you say you believed the Concerned Citizen letter was probably Zodiac, or do you think that was just a Concerned Citizen?
Well, I think we can look at some of the letters that came in, like the cipher key that came in, for example.
Yes.
Anytime you have someone who's a concerned citizen, it may well be a concerned citizen, but at the same time, I could see Zodiac just sneaking in a little something that he wants to get their attention with, and he doesn't want to do it as Zodiac, just he wants to do it as a concerned citizen, so they look into it, and it doesn't connect to him. So, it's very possible that he wrote those letters where he signs off concerned citizen. We know he wrote a citizen on one, signing off one of his letters, so it's possible he did that on these ones as well.
Yeah, that was the only argument I was trying to make. If you believe in the Concerned Citizen card, then you almost have to believe in the Good Citizen letter because the Concerned Citizen card was not released. And the chances of 2 people writing to John Lynch with exactly the same sort of style letter would be unheard of. I mean, it doesn't mean it's Zodiac, but it's certainly the same author.
Yeah, it may very well be, and it could be really someone that is really concerned, and they're just like, hey, let me keep sending this information in here until they check it out. Now, some of that stuff would be helpful to see writing, just to see what the writing looks like, because then we could maybe make our own opinions as to whether it's Zodiac or not, but unfortunately in the case, not everything's can be seen. That we don't have access to everything.
This was unfortunately just featured by Graysmith, wasn't it?
Yeah, and it just going back to like the code key itself. That wasn't something that was released until how many years ago? I don't remember when that was finally released, but it just goes to show you there's a lot of question writing and documents in this case. They may not all be Zodiac, but it would be nice to see some of them to see if we can come to some kind of opinions.
Robert Salem had been stabbed 6 times in the back. He'd been stabbed 7 times in total, but 6 in the back, just like Brian Hartnell. And there was writing at the crime scene, just like Lake Berryessa. There also appeared a sort of ritualistic element to both crimes. Now, let's go back even further. Do you see any parallels to the William Hirons murder of Frances Brown in 1945, where the killer used similar language to the Belli letter when writing on her apartment wall?
And, that's all interesting stuff. We know Zodiac may have been a reader. So, if Zodiac's involved, he may not have been involved in that older crime, but he may have been aware of it and read about it. It's possible if that ever ran in a detective magazine or something, he may very well have read about it there. So, a lot of times it's very possible he mimicked some of the stuff he used in his letters. So I think it's definitely possible that he may have been aware of an earlier crime like the 1945 crime, but not actually been the killer.
Do you think it's a viable connection, that language on her apartment wall, to the Belli letter, or do you think it's just coincidence?
If I had to guess, I'd say it's probably coincidence. But again, it doesn't hurt to take a look and go down that avenue and just see if you can explore it and see if there's anything to it.
Another thing, this might connect to the Little List letter. Robert Salem had been wearing Oriental lounging clothes when attacked. His body was found on a Japanese tatami mat used for sleeping purposes. Also, there were wooden tree trunks in his living quarters, similar to Oriental tea houses in Japan. This appears to suggest an Oriental or Japanese influence in the life of Robert Salem. This is particularly interesting, bearing in mind the only country outside the US the Zodiac referred to in his writings was Japan, when the Zodiac cited 3 versions of the Mikado in his communications. Could this have been a common link between the Zodiac killer and Salem? And do you think the Zodiac had a real interest in the Mikado, or was he likely selling us down one big rabbit hole?
It's possible. Again, worth pursuing, worth looking into. But, I think of that one letter where Zodiac had those little weird symbols at the bottom that sort of resemble Japanese writing. Some people have different theories about what that is. I always thought it looked a little bit like Japanese writing. So maybe he did have some interest in that culture. He could have been there as a child, his parents in the service, that kind of thing, military stationed over there. So he could have been exposed to that or just had an interest in it. What I'd like to know was Robert Salem, someone that was interested in the Mikado. Did he attend theater? Did he go to different San Francisco plays and stuff like that? Could they have crossed paths there? So I think something like that would be worth looking into too, to see if there's any shared interest between him and Zodiac.
Is there any way to get the police to release the reports of the Robert Salem murder, or because it hasn't been solved, they're unlikely to do so?
Well, it's funny. It's a 50-year-old case that's probably never going to be solved. And you could ask them for stuff and they'll say, sorry, this is an open investigation. It's just a standard answer, and it's really a kind of a dumb answer. If a case isn't going to be solved and there's just no way that it can be solved, why not? What's the harm in releasing certain documents and stuff? So I always hate that answer of it's an open investigation. Sorry, we're not giving you anything. It's one thing if it's a fresh case that they have a real chance of solving, but if it's like 50 years old and, it's not going to be solved, then what's the harm in releasing it? So I'm not really a fan of that answer, but there might be something in there of interest. If you read through the reports, you might see that, hey, maybe there's mention of things we don't know. Maybe Robert Salem hung out in Vallejo or something like that. Maybe he attended the theater district. Maybe he had an interest in the Mikado. So those are all things that we could, if we had access to that stuff, maybe we could find that out. Now, it may be worth pursuing to maybe find someone who knew Robert Salem or was friends with Robert Salem to sort of talk to them to see what Robert Salem was into. And that's something that I think could still be done.
And also, I may contact Gavin Fish. At the moment, he's in the Crime Con in London, but he has access to newspapers.com, which I haven't. And I can't believe, I've only found 3 newspaper articles on Robert Salem, so I can't believe they reported on it on the 20th and 21st, and then it just stopped. So there might be a lot more material out there in the newspapers, follow-ups, that may reveal extra information about his life. And that's what I'd like to get my hands on. Then we'd learn a little bit more about his life, maybe.
Yeah, it's definitely worth pursuing and trying to, see if you can do that. But again, it may be a rabbit hole, and you don't know until you look into it if it's going to be a rabbit hole, if there's something there. But a shared interest, shared connections, things like that would be worth looking at.
Yes, I don't want people to believe I'm pushing Robert Salem as a Zodiac victim, but it's always worth investigating these things just in case. I know Ray Grant believes the Robert Salem murder is a Zodiac crime. I'm not convinced yet, but it doesn't hurt to pursue these different angles and check up, because you never know.
Yeah, again, you may be going down a rabbit hole for sure, because it may not be provable in the end, but again, it's worth looking into. And just if it could somehow be connected to Zodiac, then that's one more case, and there's maybe more clues to work with, and that might tell us who Zodiac was. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Zodiac Speaking. Please make sure you're subscribed to the show wherever you're listening now, so you don't miss a single episode. New episodes of Zodiac Speaking will air every other Saturday. If you want to follow or interact with us on social media, we'd love to hear from you. You can find Zodiac Speaking on Twitter with the handle @PodcastZodiac, or you can search Facebook for Zodiac Speaking Podcast.
And don't forget, you can get plenty of Zodiac details 24/7 by visiting my site at zodiacciphers.com or by going to Mike's site at zodiackiller.net.
If you'd like to help more people find Zodiac Speaking, please take a moment to rate the show and leave a review of it on your favorite podcast player or app. As we wrap up this episode, Rich and I would like to play a preview of a true crime podcast we think you'll like. It's called DNA ID from this network, AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to give it a listen. On behalf of Rich, this is Mike Morford, and I'd like to say thanks again for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of Zodiac Speaking.
This season on DNA ID, a couple shot at a campground, a realtor waylaid at a home showing, a bookstore owner stabbed among her volumes, a young soldier dumped in a parking lot. What do all these tragic cases have in common? They are all cold cases solved after decades of frustration and futility by forensic genealogy. I'm Jess Betancourt, and in Season 2 of DNA ID, I'll bring you 24 more fascinating cases in which the killer eluded generations of investigators until science and some crafty genealogists cracked them at long last. Listen to DNA ID on your favorite podcast platform. New episodes drop every other Monday,